This is Brian Geisel for Software Off the Cuff. Today I want to talk to you about mashed potatoes and gravy. It's a philosophy I have, but I want to tell you a story first. When I was in 5th grade, my family moved to Hershey, PA, and my grandparents came to visit one day. And so we were so excited they were coming to visit. My mom made this amazing mashed potatoes, roast beef, stuffing, awesome gravy, right? Imagine like Thanksgiving dinner, right? Get that in your mind and taste Thanksgiving dinner with me for a second. All right, you got it? So I'm so excited. I got all this stuff. I'm slopping mashed potatoes on my plate. I'm filling it with roast beef. I was in 5th grade. I was going to eat this huge plate of food, right? And I grabbed the gravy container and I poured gravy all over everything. I'm like, yes, just gravy me up, baby. This is going to be amazing, right? And so I'm so psyched for this mashed potatoes and gravy. And we pray. I'm like, okay, everything is ready to go. I'm diving in. And I grab my first bite and I get, you know how you do it, right? You get some mashed potatoes on the bite. You get some roast beef on the bite. A little bit of stuffing. Covered in gravy, you got all of Thanksgiving in your first bite, right? And I take that first bite and I spew it all over the table. I must have hit my grandmother and my grandfather in the forehead. I mean, there was just chunks of food sprayed everywhere. My dad never. Now we have to say these things. My dad never hit us. He never beat us. But I'll tell you for sure, in that moment, he had to be thinking hard about it. He was ready to knock me out, I'm sure. And thankfully, quickly enough, I was able to explain what had happened. Because you see, because we were trying to be so fancy, our gravy ladle no longer had gravy in it. That was the creamy, dark salad dressing that we had for our dinner that day. I had covered all of my food in salad dressing, not delicious gravy. This comes to my philosophy that I call no surprises, because it turns out we don't like surprises as much as we might say we do, especially in business. In business, when things happen, we don't want surprises. If something's going to be late, we want to know ahead of time. If I don't know it's going to be late, I can't do anything about it. But if I know that thing's going to be late, I can make adjustments. I can talk to the clients or the customers, the end users, whoever that's going to. Maybe I can change the way our factories. We can do something about the problem. But if we don't know there's a problem, there's a surprise, we can't do anything about it, right? And so I want to talk about today, no surprises. Because both from a business standpoint and from a software development standpoint, this is a really, really important concept. If you're an executive, you know right away why no surprises is important. And as a developer, this is one of those things that's gained over experience over years. And I want to talk about a few, as always, let's do our quick dive down into a few examples of where this can be a problem in software development. So a quick example is if we're using an API and every API that we call responds in JSON. Great, awesome, no problem. And now we add a new API and it responds in XML. Is there anything wrong with XML? No, nothing wrong. XML's fine. What's wrong is that it's a surprise. I have an expectation, and I have a good reason to have the expectation, that all these APIs are going to return JSON. Now suddenly one returns XML. Why is that? We don't know, but now my JSON parser, say, is crashing perhaps. And I don't understand why that's crashing. Now I have to go debug it. I have to figure out why you implemented a stupid thing on your API. So it was a surprise. That's what caught me off guard as the consumer of your API, is you gave me a surprise. I give a surprise that I ran into one time was one of those problems that should have taken a few seconds of debugging to figure out what the problem was. And it cost me the better part of a day if it didn't cost me an entire day to debug this problem. And that was when I finally whittled down to what the problem was that was happening. My code was crashing on a statement like x equals y. It was crashing. It was getting memory corruption on x equals y. Is x valid? X is totally valid. Y is totally valid. Value is totally valid. What in the world could be happening? Why could X equals Y crash? Well, it was C++ code, and in C++ we have something, as many languages do, called operator overloading, which means simply that you can make the equal sign do anything you want it to do. You can just write a function that when the equal sign is called, your function happens, and so you do whatever your function is. In this case, the equal sign was allocating memory. That is very unexpected from a developer standpoint. If I say X equals Y, the thing I expect you to do is take the value from Y and assign it to X. Maybe you overload it because Y is a different type of object, and maybe you're going to format that in a way that makes sense to assign it into X. But in no point should you allocate memory because it's a surprise. Now, when someone goes to debug this, it's not what they're expecting, and so it takes way, way, way longer to figure out what it is that's happening. And I'll give you one example that's even a little bit further than that. That is, we're using an HTML framework, PHP framework, and that framework interfaces to the database for you. Now, it's very, very important that databases are, for the calls that they make, that are, we talk about ACID, but I'll just sort of tighten that down to saying they need to be atomic. In other words, when I call an operation, it has to all happen at exactly the same time, or at least from my standpoint. So it can't, one piece happens, and then, another piece happens, and those two pieces become disjointed. It has to happen all at once, or bad things happen in the database. Well, what this framework was doing was, when we were inserting objects into the database, sometimes, just randomly, it would not insert all of the objects for you. It would do it in different groups. And so when it came back with the pointer to your first object, and you say, okay, here's my pointer, and now I'm going to do something with my first object, sometimes it was your first object, sometimes it wasn't. So we had the discussion with the maintainers of the framework, and they said, oh, that works the way we created it to work. Yes, but it's not the way a developer expects it to work, because a database is expected to work in this particular way. So when you wrap that function in your other function, it should have the same basic behavior and guarantees as that underlying database. Sometimes there's a great why as to why it can't do that. That should be well documented. Everyone should be very clear about what that is. In this case, there was no why. It was just, well, we implemented it a different way that doesn't guarantee you that safety. And so many, many programs actually probably today still in the wild will have this bug that they don't know even exists in their code until they maybe happen to run into it one day, because they coded to what they were expecting, and this was a surprise. So what's the other side of that? I believe in balance. Sometimes surprises are okay, but they've got to be in context. What's that context? Okay, so if we thought an equal sign was really important to allocate memory, let's say that's something we do in our framework or in our library all the time. We do it over and over again, and it just would be so much more complex if our program didn't do that. Well, then that's a reasonable thing to evaluate and decide if that's valid or something that maybe we should do. In that case, it's very important to make it very clear. This framework, in your documentation, this framework implements an operator overload on the equal sign. And here's a thing you might not be expecting. And so we make that same decision in our company all the time as we're writing software for ourselves and for other clients. We'll say, okay, this thing is going to make this whole framework way, way easier to work with, but it's going to add a surprise. So we want to let all of our development team know. We want to make sure it's very clearly labeled in the documentation so that as much as possible, it's not a surprise. So I want to encourage you today, no surprises. So that means as a developer, no surprises to other developers. That means no surprises to your management. If something's going to be late, if there's an issue with something, you've got to push that information up. You've got to let people know that there's a problem. And from the top level, no surprises to your developers. And so this usually comes in the form of added features, new things that we want to change in the product, all those kinds of things. I'm sure we'll talk about that in more episodes of Off the Cuff. But today I want to encourage you, always be thinking about surprises and avoiding surprises at all cost. This is Brian Geisel, And this has been Off the Cuff.